Good day and welcome to this episode of the Neurokrish Immersion, where we are in conversation with Dr. Jesus Ramirez-Bermudez from the National Institute for Neurology and Neurosurgery in Mexico. And he is going to talk to us today about his very interesting paper, Finitude and Melancholy. Hi, Dr. Jesus. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your work and what got you interested in this topic?
Of course, Dr. Krish. First of all, I would like to say that you have been a great inspiration for some of us who have been formed in the field of neuropsychiatry in the last decades. So thanks a lot for your academic work. And now thanks also for this kind of work on scientific communication. Myself, I work as a clinical neuropsychiatrist in the National Institute of Neurology in Mexico. I do clinical work, but also academic and research work, mostly focused on autoimmune psychosis and related fields. But I am interested in a lot of topics within the field of neurology and psychiatry. And like yourself, I am also interested in the scientific communication with a larger audience. So I have been engaging into literary work here in my own country, in my own mother tongue, in Spanish. I've published a number of books for a larger audience. The first book was called, it would be translated like the Brief Clinical Dictionary of the Soul. So it was involved into some of the questions that arise when you mix literature with humanities and a bit of philosophy, but you see those problems from the lens of clinical practice. So it was organized as a dictionary. It would start in Spanish with alucinaciones, which would be hallucinations. So following the alphabetic order, I would deal with each of the clinical problems through clinical stories, but also a bit of literary essay. As you know, literary essay is not as constrained as academic essay. Instead, it is like they say, it is like walking, no, without a purpose, without a goal exactly, but mostly in the spirit of discovery, the discovery of ideas. So that is the tradition of literary essay coming from Michel de Montaigne. So in this kind of literary work, I try to follow that kind of spirit. And more recently, I wrote a book which would be translated as the Creative Melancholy. So that book is directly related with the essay that we are discussing today, Finitude and Melancholy. And I was interested in the relationship between psychopathology on one hand, and on the other hand, the problem of creativity, more specifically literary creativity. And in pursuing that kind of reflection, I went through a number of classic works, like the classic work by Aristotle, right? The problem of Aristotle, in which he states those old classic words about the relationship between melancholy on one hand and creativity on the other.
Wonderful. I mean, we probably should make your first book the subject of another podcast.
Yes.
How interesting the soul is to talk about. You use two terms here, finitude and melancholia. Would you like to explain the meaning of those terms to the audience before we take the discussion further?
Yes, of course. So first I should explain that in this kind of literary work, I I engage a lot with words that come from the tradition of philosophy or literature, and sometimes they are already have been assimilated into the popular culture, like the soul. And I think those words are interesting metaphors for us to reflect on our language of the mental, our language of the psychological, our language of the cognitive dimension and affective dimension of our lives. And I think that we always need to develop that language of subjectivity, because it is still a matter of great scientific interest. Now, specifically on melancholy and finitude, so melancholy was initially a word coined by Greek physicians. It comes from the tradition of Hippocrates. It is in the Corpus Hippocraticum. So as known, this is a book that was written 25 centuries ago. So it's pretty old, and nobody knows exactly what was the kind of clinical problem that Hippocrates was seeing. Dr. Germán Berrios from Cambridge, who is a great researcher in the field of history, thinks that it was initially a way to speak about patients with malaria, which was an important problem in ancient Greece. But nobody knows exactly. The word melancholy appears like 50 times in the Corpus Hippocraticum. And of course, the meaning, the literal meaning, has to do with the black bile, right? The black bile. But eventually it became a metaphor for a kind of temperament, which had to do with this temperament in which some emotions like sadness and solitude and some kind of isolation could lead to a kind of creative reflection. So it was a preferred word for philosophers. I already mentioned that there's a famous text that has been attributed to Aristotle, although nobody knows exactly if it was written by Aristotle. It is the Problem 30. So that's how it is known in the field. And in that text, Aristotle makes the relationship between creativity and melancholy. Now, as you know, melancholy became a word of medicine, and that was the usage of the word in Roman medicine, and then in the Renaissance, and all the way to the 19th century. And we can find the usage of that word extensively in the work of the early alienists, the early psychiatrists. One can find that word in the works by Griesinger. And I think that a critical point in the history of psychiatry is when melancholy gets transformed into depression. Now, we know that the word depression appears in the medical dictionaries around 1850s, in the 1850s. So the middle of the 19th century, the word depression appears. And in one book by Emil Kraepelin, his work on manic depressive illness, the chapter dedicated to the depressive states still uses the word melancholy. So Kraepelin would use the word the delusional melancholia, and so on. So eventually, melancholy was replaced by depression, but as you know, we still have a melancholic form of depression, which would be a severe and often psychotic form of depression. So for me, it was very interesting to see this wide semantics of the word, which has a side on literature, which is also of interest for philosophers, but also for physicians. And more specifically, in my text, I dealt with the diagnosis of melancholy in the context of the Inquisition well, it was not Mexico yet, it was the New Spain. Now, the other word, finitude, is a word that I took from the field of philosophy, more specifically from the work of German philosophy from the tradition of hermeneutics. Hans-Georg Gadamer used to say that his philosophy was a philosophy of finitude. And I also found that work in that word in the work of Spanish philosopher Maria Zambrano, who was one of the most important female philosophers in the 20th century. And so the consciousness of finitude means that we see the end of things, our own mortality, and that we become aware of that mortality. So we need to engage in our own lives with a consciousness of with the consciousness that our own lives are going to end, and that is the kind of reflection that, from my perspective, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who is the most important poet from the Spanish tradition here in Mexico, she makes this poem, First Dream, in which she, from my point of view, combines these two topics, melancholy and the problem of finitude.
You'll talk about how her search for knowledge, infused with melancholy, offers a different lens through which one can understand profound human experience. Would you like to elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, of course, Dr. Krish. So, in this article, Finitude and Melancholy, I was interested in the experience of people who was diagnosed as having a clinical problem of melancholy after being accused of heresy. So this is an interesting combination of things. Some people gets accused of heresy, like in the 17th century, or in the or even earlier in the New Spain. But someone in these trials that are being done to assess if these are true cases of heresy, someone would say that this person doesn't have a problem of heresy, but instead they have a problem of melancholy. So the word melancholy, that the diagnosis of melancholy, becomes a way to discuss in the mind of these judges and these people who are making the trials. It becomes a point of reference, a concept to discuss what is the mental state of these people. Because if they truly have melancholy, they would not be accused of having a problem of heresy. So in the text, I go through one example, the example of Sor María de la Natividad. She was, well, in fact, she accused herself of having a problem of heresy because she was insulting Jesus Christ and insulting God. But one of the witnesses would say that she had a problem of melancholy. So, from my point of view, she has probably a form of mental illness that was diagnosed at that time as melancholy. My point of the bridge that I tried to establish with the search for knowledge of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who is a poet, is also within the spirit of melancholy, but perhaps not a clinical problem of melancholy, but instead she goes through the creative aspect of melancholy. But the kind of the reflections that she make is in a way similar to the discourse of these people with clinical problems of melancholy, because both will use a critical lens to approach the problem of divinity, which was the initial reason why some people would be judged as having heresy, because they will use a critical lens to approach the problem of God, divinity, the infinite, transcendence, and so on. So the search for knowledge of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is through the art of poetry, and she writes this wonderful and philosophical poem, which is called Primero Sueño, the first dream. So she uses the metaphor of herself going like in a journey through the universe and looking at the wonders of the universe, and more specifically the wonders of human mind. But she finds out that human mind is finite, so it cannot reach the infinite. It cannot reach the divinity. It cannot reach God. So she chooses to she chooses to remain within what I call in the article the field of immanence, which would be the realm of our own existence on Earth. So in a way, she renounces to divinity, and she renounces to transcendence, and she chooses instead to go through the conflicts of the living beings, knowing that she will die, renouncing to that form of transcendence that was the main spirit of the time, because we in Mexico at that time we were under the realm of the Catholic Church. So it is an early exercise of philosophical work through the art of poetry, in which we see a separation between poetry and the arts on one hand and religion on the other. And that has a price. And the price that Sor Juana pays is the price of melancholy, right? So that is in a way the reflection. Now, what would be exactly the gain that she would have as because she pays a price, right? The price of melancholy. But she also has a gain from my point of view. And the gain that she has is being conscious of her own consciousness. So that is the topic of metaconsciousness or metacognition, right? That is the gain from my point of view, because this philosophical reflection using the resources of poetry allows her to understand that she has a deep desire for the infinite, for divinity, but she makes a rational exercise, and her own reason tells her that she cannot reach the divine. So she's perfectly aware of her own desires and the limits of her reason. So that's why I think that she discovers the realm of metacognition. So that is, in a way, that the topic of the article.
Wonderful. Famous figures in our history, real creative geniuses like Van Gogh, like Beethoven, like Hemingway, have been thought to have a melancholic temperament. What's the direction of the relationship? Is it melancholia leading to creativity? Oh, fantastic, immense creativity that each one of these people were able to, display? Or is it creativity leading to melancholia? What do you think? In which direction does this relationship go?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And in the book, The Creative Melancholy, I tried to explore the different scientific hypotheses that have been posed on this topic. So, for instance, Kay Jamison has a wonderful book, Touched by Fire, in which she deals with some of these famous characters like Van Gogh and others, like Virginia Woolf also. And she, her thesis is that they have a severe form of mental illness. In her own book, it is mainly manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder. And herself, she was diagnosed as having also bipolar disorder. And she thinks that there is a state which is not as severe as depression and is not as severe as mania. So in the states of hypomania or hyperthymic states, some people is able to increase their own mental activity, like the psychomotor flow and the motivation, and they are able to engage in creative synthesis because as they have a heightened sense of the relationship between different things, they can relate things that otherwise we would feel that are distant and non-related. So they can create new creative synthesis, like new metaphors or new works of art in the field of visual arts, for instance. So her own thesis is that, in fact, this attenuated states that are not as severe as mania or depression could lead to heightened creativity. And also, I would like to complement that thesis by saying that people with depression or people with bipolar disorder or other mental illnesses, in a way, they have a lived experience, a phenomenological experience, which is a field of discovery of mental states for which we don't have a very developed language in popular culture, because they refer to atypical, uncommon states of mind. So it is, in a way, a field for creative work as well. Now, of course, as a psychiatrist, I would like to stress that, and this was work by a Mexican researcher, Dr. Rosa Aurora Chavez. She made her PhD work on creativity and psychopathology. And what she found is that by looking at people who are highly creative in the field of arts, when they are severely depressed, they cannot create, right? It's when the writer blocks begins, and the own writers and filmmakers and poets will talk about this. Like, for instance, William Styron, a famous American writer, has a wonderful book which is called Darkness Visible, in which he narrates his own experience of depression. And it is a wonderful text for those who go into a romanticization of mental illness. No? I wouldn't like to go into a romanticization of mental illness. So my own hypothesis is that the experience of mental illness provides with a rich phenomenological experience that can be the source of creativity, but not when the person is in the severe forms of depression or in the states of psychosis, but perhaps later on, when they recover, at least partially, their own mental health and are able to reflect on it or use it as a source for poetry, fiction, and so on.
Wonderful. The other question I have, which is sort of related to this, is neurodivergent people with ADHD or high functioning autism spectrum disorder, also have this capacity to hyperfocus and be very productive in short periods of time. do you see a link? Do you see, the mood state as being responsible in those cases as well, or are there other mechanisms at play?
No, I think it's a great question. And my own thoughts about it is that any form of psychological diversity, whether it is neurodiversity, like in the form of autistic traits or ADHD or whatever form of psychological diversity, can lead the person to have perhaps a different understanding of the world, a different mindset, a different conception of reality, a different phenomenological experience. So it can be the source for creative work. Of course, it is not sufficient, right? We need a combination of factors to go into creative work. But I think that diversity, psychological diversity, is certainly a source of experiences that can be used for creative work. And as you were saying, this capacity to hyper-focus was explored by different people like Temple Grandin, or Simon Baron-Cohen himself wrote this wonderful book, The Pattern Seekers, right? In which he poses that also attenuated forms of autistic spectrum could lead to forms of creativity that sometimes are closer to technological invention, because this clinical phenotype would be related to seeking patterns and invention, because they become this people with this kind of mindset or neurodiversity would have perhaps an increased capacity to systematize. So systematization could be a source for technological creativity, but also it could be a source for artistic creativity as well. So one thing that I appreciate from the field of arts is that it gives us a great respect for all forms of psychological diversity, whether it goes into the spirit of melancholy or the realms of manic depressive illness, or closer to the psychotic spectrum, as was explored by Karl Jaspers in his own book on genius and artistic creativity. So I think that this gives us a somewhat positive view of the opportunities for this kind of diversity. Now, once again, as a clinician, I wouldn't like to give a romanticization of madness as others do. I only want to highlight this positive side of this psychological diversity, because even as clinicians, and you can perhaps agree with me on this, we need sources for resilience when working with our own patients, right? When we work with clinical problems like psychosis or depression and so on, we of course have to focus on the problematic side of that clinical entity, but also we need to focus on the protective side for the psychological lives of our own patients. And well, I think this relationship with artistic creativity and so on can be a resource for clinicians as well.
Thank you. This brings me to two questions. The first is a healthy contemplative melancholy, if there is such a thing. How is it different from something that may be more destructive, or something that may have greater destructive potential for the human in terms of melancholia that takes them down a negative path? Could you explain that?
Yes, that's completely right. And in my own essay, my hypothesis was that metacognition makes the difference, right? Because the states of melancholy, which nowadays perhaps would be regarded as states of depression, change our perception of the world, the perception of ourselves, and that can lead to interesting insights, and introspections. But if the metacognitive ability becomes somewhat defective, we can go into severe forms of depression, like would be the case in psychotic depression, right? I remember the case of a patient. I visited him in the hospital. I think it was Christmas, and he showed me the landscape of the hospital, and I was able to see the world through his eyes, and he demonstrated me that the world was a solitary and terrible place to live in. For instance, he would show me a tree that was in front of us, and the tree had no leaves no longer, right? It was completely dry. Now, he showed me a painting that was done by other patients that was supposed to bring some hope to the patients, because it was a painting about the birth of Jesus Christ. But the patients that painted that work were confused, so they painted the star that was supposed to indicate that the Messiah was about to be born. They painted it as if it was going away from the earth, not coming to the earth. It was an error by the painters, but my patient couldn't prevent himself from focusing on those details of the landscape that confirmed that he was condemned, right? So these are interesting insights, interesting introspections. But as the patient is severely biased by his own mental illness, he cannot use these aesthetic experiences for creativity or for physical reflection or for having an insight about himself in looking for a way to improve his own life. These are only sources for confirming that he's condemned, right? It was an nihilistic delusion in the form of a Cotard syndrome. Instead, the person that I work with in my own essay, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, contemplates. She goes into this form of contemplative melancholy, as you call it, and she's able to see also the same signs in the landscapes of her own life that could confirm that we are condemned as persons, even as a species, as a human species. But she doesn't follow that path in her own reasoning. She only goes as far as acknowledging the finitude of our own lives and the need to connect with our own sources for vitality, the things that makes us feel alive, the things that give meaning to our own lives, a sense of purpose. So the consciousness, the awareness of finitude becomes paradoxically a way to recover the urgency to connect with our own sources of meaning, purpose, and our own sense making of our own lives, right? So I think that is the difference. But perhaps the most important dimension that separates mental illness from the creative forms of melancholy is metacognition. So how can we increase our own powers of our own metacognitive abilities. I think that it is through reflection, through critical thought, through dialogue, through conversation, and perhaps that is why it is so important to keep on with the conversation, right? With our own patients, with our own friends and families, with yourself right now in this conversation. We need to engage, and sometimes we need to acknowledge our own errors. So we need to remain open to the possibility that we are, in fact, going through a existential error or a cognitive error in our reasoning, and that is the essence of metacognition, right?
Absolutely. The other question I had for you in relation to that was, as a physician and especially as mental health professionals, we come across a lot of melancholia and a lot of experiences, for example, suicide or other circumstances that remind us of our own finitude. How do people experiencing those things from the outside, whether they are mental health professionals or indeed a caregiver of someone who is going through a very difficult time and say, for example, chooses to complete an act of suicide or attempt an act of suicide. How do we sort of deal with that sense of finitude? How do we cope with it when we experience it?
You mean as from the perspective of the mental health clinicians, right?
From the perspective of the mental health clinician, or I'm also thinking about the mental health experiencer, someone who's watching mental illness up close, like a caregiver. You're looking after someone either as a professional or in a personal way, who is going through severe depression, for example, or psychotic depression, as you were saying, and then there is an act of finality which is either attempted or completed, and that, of course, that reminds us of our own terminality, apart from affecting our how we feel about things and impacting our mood, impacting our ability to cope. It also affects how we see our own, how we experience our own terminality. So I'm just, what lessons do we have to cope with those situations when we look at how do we convert this into contemplative melancholia? How do we use this as a hook in order to, move ourselves to a more positive space, perhaps by engaging our metacognition, unlocking our creativity? What is it that we can do?
Yes, it's a very important question, Dr. Krish. Thanks for asking this. And I think that it is, of course, very distressing, when one is with someone, a loved one, for instance, or a patient who is undergoing a mental state in which they prefer to end their own lives, right? So there is an ethical dimension in this problem. There is an emotional dimension. We are always moved by this kind of circumstance, and I think that we need to approach this with a lot of respect for those who undergo that kind of suffering. But either from the professional side or from the literary point of view, I think that each case of suicide, for instance, has a lot of lessons to teach us, right? In a way. I was thinking now in the figure, you must remember the scientific hypothesis of learned helplessness, right? Which was one of the ways to explain the development of severe depression. So if one studies depression from that lens, we would need to acknowledge the many factors that contribute to that form of learned helplessness. So in a way, each case of depression, each case of melancholy, each case of suicide shows us a picture of the world, and that picture is a problematic picture, right? We can acknowledge problems like the adverse experiences in childhood, the problem of childhood maltreatment, the problem of violence in my own society. For instance, in Mexico, there's a lot of violence against women, against sexual minorities, the problems of inequality. So in a way, the problem of suicide takes us all the way to those realities that we need to acknowledge. And from that big sociological picture, we need to make a case formulation from my point of view to see exactly what are the specific sources in the trajectory of my own patient, of my own loved one, and how can I prevent or protect the patient from those specific sources, right? So we can go, of course, into a kind of clinical work, working directly to the depressive syndrome, if that is the case, or the psychotic illness, if that is the case. But we also need to acknowledge the bigger picture. That's my perspective, no? In order to make some work of prevention. Now, for the general public, right, a general audience of people who is not in the field of mental health professions, I think it's very distressing to deal with this kind of problems, but that doesn't mean that we cannot offer, I think, two things, right? So I would, of course, use the concept of empathy, but not in a simplified way, right? Because empathy, from the lens of Frans de Waal, the famous ethologist, involves three mental states, or three mental processes. The first one is the emotional contagion, which impacts us more immediately. So if the patient has a lot of anger, perhaps we can also feel a lot of anger. If the patient has a lot of sadness, perhaps we can also feel a lot of sadness. But then the second process is the sympathetic concern, right? Like the feeling of compassion. Of course, that involves a lot of moral questioning for the person who is with the person who is committing a suicide, or in that kind of mindset. So the second process is the sympathetic concern. But the third part perhaps is the most important, which is perspective taking. Frans de Waal stresses that to have a complete process of empathy, we need perspective taking. So perspective taking means to see the problem from the lens of the other, right? So this form of intersubjectivity, or this capacity for attributing mental states to the other, this capacity for theory of mind, can be very useful to understand the other and not simply react emotionally to the states of the other. And I think that when we give company to someone in distress, and we go through this process, we are able to understand better the other. And once the other feels understood, that can have perhaps a small therapeutic effect, but it is a therapeutic effect nonetheless. Now, if everything fails and we think that our own efforts are not having the effect that we wish that they have. Well, we have to also make a reflection of our own limitations, right? Which is very difficult, especially for mental health professionals. But we need to acknowledge that we have limited resources. We, of course, need to be compassionate and empathic and rational, but we need to acknowledge our own limitations because, of course, in a way, this problem of emotional contagion perhaps can explain, at least partly, the problem of mental illness within the field of mental health professionals, right? As you can acknowledge with myself that there is an increased risk of suicide in physicians, in psychiatrists, in psychotherapists, and so on. So we also need to acknowledge our own limitations. And as a professor told me, we need to remember to be our own friends, to relate with ourselves as if we were our own friends. And well, that's what some old professor told me, and that's what my reflection tells me right now.
Wonderful. I have this kind of integrated question for you. You combine the study of history, philosophy, psychology, psychiatry into your clinical practice and clinical work. The question I have is, how impactful and useful have you found this as a practitioner of psychiatry and neuropsychiatry? How important is this for us to teach to young doctors and medical students?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. So, as I work in the Institute of Neurology, the mainstream, the traditional way to approach clinical problems is through the lens of medicine, which is a wonderful resource, of course, a very important one. And perhaps you agree with me that as clinicians, we undergo a process of diagnostic reasoning when approaching our patients. A diagnostic reasoning, it is a form of reasoning in which we use the resources of deduction and induction and abduction and others as well. And we try to articulate the symptoms, the signs, every clinical evidence that could be relevant to make a diagnostic synthesis after making a diagnostic analysis of the possibilities of the case. Now, that is very useful, but it doesn't approach as well to what makes the patient unique, right? So, to me, the diagnostic reasoning connects the case with the general knowledge of that kind of illness. For instance, if I am with a patient with psychosis, through the diagnostic synthesis, I can relate that specific case to the general scientific literature on psychosis, which is helpful, of course. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient to provide a good medical care, a good clinical care. We also need to make a case formulation which acknowledges what we call the idiographic aspect of the case. So the idiographic aspect of the case focuses on the longitudinal trajectory of the person, their history of interactions, the context of the patient, and the context means, to me, the system of relationships in which the patient is immersed. So we need to focus on the system of relationship, the history of interactions, the broader context, and the personality, of course, the cognitive style, the affective style, and the sense of purpose of the person, their own process of meaning making. So all of this is the ideographic approach to mental health. And I think that the best way to approach the ideographic dimension of mental health is with the resources of narrative medicine, or what I call in my own paper the clinical narratives. So we can learn a lot by looking at classical literature, whether it's fiction or poetry or literary essay, because it, in a way, it crystallizes the wisdom of very intelligent people that was observing other people through their lives. Like I'm thinking of writers like Dostoevsky or Lev Tolstoy or Shakespeare, right? Who make an amazing synthesis of the existential problems of their own characters. Think of Hamlet, or think of that kind of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's novel, right? Crime and Punishment. So that kind of narrative can provide very important insights when we try to move from seeing the patient as a patient, from seeing the patient as a person, right? And I think that good clinicians have both capacities. They need to go into the medical rationality that can be very helpful, but also they need to move sometimes into what I would call the interpersonal understanding. Patients need that as well.
Wonderful. I think there's so much to be learned from these other fields of experience, of knowledge, of creative expression that can teach us and I think influence the way that we relate to people and how we practice in the field of mental health and how we deal also with our fellow men. I'm going to ask you one final question. There is the interesting quote by Maria Zamboro: "The love of knowledge determines the way of dying." Would you like to elaborate on this and your thoughts in this regard? What are the implications for modern education and intellectual pursuits, and particularly how it might either exacerbate or constructively channel melancholic tendencies in people?
Thank you very much. I think there's an important lesson here for physicians specifically, because physicians work with the process of dying, right, in their own patients. And I mean, everybody needs to approach the problem of death in our own lives, whether it is the death of our loved ones, or in the case of physicians, the death of their patients. So this quote from Maria Zambrano was about the sense of philosophy as preparing ourselves for the moment of death. From my perspective, this forces us to take seriously the problem of our own process of meaning making, our own sense of purpose, and the meaning of our lives. So it goes into the realms of existential psychiatry, which was an important tradition in psychiatry. And to me, this is very important, because when we approach death, it is very important the medical facts leading to death, right? Like the brain infection, or the state of sepsis, or the heart disease, and so on. But sometimes as physicians, we forget that it is the moment in which a person can finish their own lives from the perspective of the symbolic aspect of their lives, right? We as persons, we want to think that our lives are meaningful and that we are able to articulate our own values in a narrative that starts and ends. So to me, awareness of finitude, this way of approaching our way of dying, connects with the need to respect those values. So what about, as clinicians, as physicians, what about asking our patients what are their own values? Do they want to end their lives through an act of forgiveness or an act of gratitude? Or what is the value that they want to transmit while they still can? To me, that is very important, and I am sure that many physicians forget this. We are so determined to save the patient and so on, that we forget that that symbolic dimension of life is as important as the biological facts. And I say this not only as a clinician, but as a person. And I think that you would agree with myself, right? That we need to feel that our lives are meaningful and so on. So I think that is the thing that Maria Zambrano is trying to remind us. And philosophy is a way to approach that existential dimension, but also literature, poetry, existential psychiatry, and so on is a way to approach that existential dimension that I think we should not forget. What about yourself, Dr. Krish? What are your own thoughts on these things that we've been discussing? Allow me to ask you that question.
Thank you. So one of my more recent podcasts was about death and dying. And I looked at it from the lens, a cross-cultural lens, but in particular, I was looking at it through the lens of the Tibetan book of living and dying, and what Tibetan Buddhism had to say. And I think talking to you today, I'm taking away two lessons, which I think are important to all our listeners as well, that you can channel your melancholia into one that is contemplative, one that is metacognitive, and one that can be creative and lead you to a better realization. That's possible for all of us. And it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a melancholic temperament. And there are many great people, as you pointed out, who have had a melancholic temperament and contributed so much to society. And the other lesson I'm taking away is that awareness of your own mortality, finitude, can perhaps influence you to be more purposeful, more contributory, and more compassionate in the time that you have in this universe, well, at least on this earth. And, so I think while both these thoughts of one's own limited mortality and an experience of melancholia can be thought of negatively, I think what you've done is use history, philosophy, and literature to point out to us that these have positives built within them that can influence our lives and give them meaning and purpose. And I think that's probably what I'd like to take away from our conversation today and from your wonderful paper. And I'll encourage everyone to look up the paper, which is an essay in the brain on the journal Brain, a very prestigious journal on finitude and melancholy.
Yes, Dr. Krish, I appreciate a lot those words. I think you have summarized in a very kind and interesting way this conversation, and I agree. I would only like to focus on one more topic in the end of this conversation, which is the last words in my own paper were words of gratitude towards this female poet, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, because I think that her own work of reflection, introspection, which was painful in a way, led to a kind of awareness not only for herself, but also for me as a reader and for many other readers. And I think that is perhaps the most important part of that kind of work, right? That it becomes contagious in a good way. So we can learn from the others through the cultural resources, and we need to acknowledge that with gratitude towards those who suffer. But even when they suffer, they leave to us this kind of messages and cultural products.
Wonderful. I think very nice thoughts to end this podcast with. Thank you very much for being with us and spending your time, Dr. Jesus. And if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please like it. Please follow us on. We are on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, and you can enjoy the visual version of this podcast on YouTube as well. Thank you so much, and it's been wonderful talking to you about finitude and melancholy. Thank you.
Thanks to you.